Hey everybody, welcome back into the studio. Today I'd like to start this episode by saying I hope everyone out there is staying safe through this COVID-19 issue. The whole world's going through it. We're going through it together. We'll get through it. We'll be better for it on the back end. But as we go through it, let's all think about those that are a lot more at high risk, like the elderly and all that. Maybe there's something you could do for them, collect some food for them, you know, let's reduce their exposure to this virus, and let's keep everybody safe. All right. So today, I got for you a couple of months back. I painted Serenity's Rhythm, and it was a big hit. Everybody loved it. It was one of my Power to Paint full instructional lessons on powertopaint.com. But I got a lot of emails. People were saying they really liked the instruction, but they wish they had got a little more instruction during the cascading water. So I thought what I'd do is I'd take that section today and I'd do a full commentary of do's and don'ts, what's to do, and tricks and techniques I use to do the cascading water. Now, that's good news and bad news. The good news is it's fully commentated for a full 26 minutes. The bad news is I never shut up, so I'll take the good with the bad. Anyways, while I get back to work here doing your next lesson, why don't we go take a look at the video, and as always, if you have any questions about what you see, just write a comment down there. I'll respond to it as soon as possible. And of course, like it, share it, and subscribe to me. And also hit the notification button, bell, and you'll know whenever I put a new video up. So let's get in the studio and let me show you how to do cascading water. So today we're going to learn to do one of my favorite textures. Now, the two things that I'm really known for is my water and my snow. And I probably paint those a lot better than other textures just because I love them the most. And why do I love them the most? Because they're never the same. Every time you paint water, it's always completely different. The nice thing about water is it's always changing. Even when you're photographing it, it'll change from one second to the other. That's why I love water, because it's always fresh and exciting and a challenge to do. And the same thing with snow. The lighting's always different. The texture is always different. It's always a challenge. And I love to paint things that are challenging. So, as I said in the intro, this is a section of the whole lesson I did on Serenity's Rhythm. And a lot of people, I get requests for doing water. So I thought I'd show you how I painted the cascading water. Now, it's the same as anything else. The key is setting up a good structure. Now, of course, I didn't show the setup of creating the initial structure here. I'm more concentrating on this video on how to actually create the bubbles. Okay, so let's concentrate on those. Now, you can see right here that what I'm doing is the same as any other texture I do. I laid in a section and now I'm breaking it up. And it's a lot easier to do larger sections and break them down when you're doing high detail, because if I try to paint in all these bubbles right off the get-go, one, it would look terrible. It would probably look very mechanical, and it would also look unrealistic. So learning the process of no matter how you paint or who you paint or what you paint, it's always the same process. You'll see that all of us artists will block in or do our underpainting, whichever you would like to call it. Then we'll build up our shape and form, and then we'll add our detail. And it's not a coincidence that we all use the same formula. We all use the same formula because that's the formula that works, okay? So, getting back to the actual instruction here, you can see that I'm now breaking down my areas. And I can start to add detail now. Why? Because the structure is all set up for me. Like, for instance, let's just take this area down here. You see how I've set up the initial structure of the bubbles? Now I can just go in and break them up one by one. Here I'm painting the background. I laid in a nice blue base, which was my local color, and now I'm breaking it up and I can concentrate more on the direction and the flow of the swirls. Okay? So always remember to don't forget is a better way of saying it, to build up your structure before you detail. I see so many people that get frustrated because they paint up a section really nice and they love it, and then they paint up another section and all of a sudden that first section doesn't look so good. Well, that's because you didn't have all this build up, the foundation, the shape and form created and you tried to blend them into each other. So build up all your shape and form, then break it down and create your detail. Okay? So as I'm starting to break up the area with little bubbles here, I think I should go over one more thing too. And again, down in this bottom area, do you see how there's a bright, saturated yellowy white right here, and then the cool violets? Well, that's because I've set up the shadow for the piling that's behind here. It's going to cast a shadow. So in my structure, one of the things I set up is not only the shape and form, but also creating that shape and form through the use of warms and cools. Okay, so be aware that you need to lay in both warms and cools. Again, I see people who are very afraid. I think it's probably the number one thing I find in my art instruction workshops is that people are afraid to put too much warmth in or too much darks, and you need both. When it comes to value, you need your darks to make your lights light, and you need your lights to make your darks dark. You also need your warms to make your cools cool, and vice versa. So I think you're getting it now. So the idea is not only to have your darks and lights, but your warms and cools. So back to the actual painting. Here I'm laying in my cooler, darker shadow areas, and you see, by just blocking in that purple in the initial shape and then going in and creating a few simple strokes, I'm already getting a sense of bubbling and cascading and creating more form. So before I do any kind of detailing, I'm building up my form. Do you see the process in action here? Laying down the purple. Number one, laying in my local color. It's the underpainting. Number two, putting in my shadows, my darks, my lights, creates my shape and my form. The bigger a contrast in your shapes and your values, the deeper the gully or the crack, or in this specific instance, the deeper the value change, the higher the bubbles are going to be, okay? Because that's what we're making, is cascading bubbles here. So as I put in this kind of violety green color, I'm creating the deep recessed areas in my bubbles, and as I break it up, more and more bubble shape comes in, and having that shape and form is so important. I know all of you are sitting there right now going, all right, Derek, we get it, move on. But the thing is as much as I talk about it, you'd be surprised on how many times I see people just trying to bypass. They build up a shape and form before they start detailing, because let's face it, if you're a high detail artist, you want to get to detailing. Fight the urge. Do your process, the 3 steps, lay in your local color, your underpainting, if you will. Your shape and form is built, and then you can detail it. So as you can see now, I start putting the tops of the bubbles on. I only know where the tops of these bubbles are because I built up my shape and form, and I know where one bubble starts and the other bubble ends. Without that shape and form, I'd be lost. And again, just like when we were putting in the shadowed areas, a few simple strokes and boom, look at how much cascading water the feel that we already have, and we've done really very little. But we did the process correctly, so now it's working to our advantage. You know, I love painting cascading water. And why? Because it has so much energy, so much rhythm and power. And how do you get that power? Well, you vary your values, okay? The higher the value change, the more of a depth change you're telling people. Now, if you wanted to stay on the same level, you would change your actual chroma, your color, keep your value the same, and that tells the viewer you're staying on the same plane. But the whole thing about bubbles is they're different planes, and they're different heights. So with that in mind, right now, I'm starting to do the little tiny bubbles that are, the water's, dissipating as it hits the shore. So it's kind of softening off. And here the bubbles are very, very, very low. They're not the big cascading ones like in the middle. So how do I translate that into paint? Well, there's 2 things I can do. 1, I do a shorter stroke. And 2, I don't have a lot of big value changes. But now here in the middle, where all the impact and the energy is, I make very big value changes. And this tells the viewer there's more depth here. So lower value change tells the viewer very soft depth change. Big value changes tell the viewer big, deep depth changes. So as this dark dries, like for instance right here, you can see that it creates a deeper valley behind this big bubble, which actually brings that big bubble out. So do you get what I mean about using, learn to use your values to your advantage. And again, I'll reiterate, you know, when you have huge value changes, then you're telling the viewer there's a bigger, deeper gap, valley, whatever it may be. Smaller value changes means there's very little change in the plane, in the height, depth, or what have you of the plane, okay? So with that in mind, as I move over to this side, you can see that I start making my bubbles a little more shallower, and I don't have as much value change, all right? Whereas I get to the middle, I have huge value changes. I get into darker shadowed areas behind the bubbles, and also lighter bubbles on the top. As we go along here, we'll actually do pinging. As we get over to the edge of the rippling or the cascading, you're going to get that translucent water, the water that gets shot up in the air. So you have to change your brush stroke again to make it more of a squiggly line now. And that's telling viewers, okay, this is going to be more of a shoot up. Now we're just going to block in the edges of that for now, and we'll come back to it a little later. What I'm more concerned about doing right now is continuing the shadowing in the highlight cover over here. So what I did is I actually took the shadow color, add a little bit of that, but added in a lot of titanium white and a lot of cadmium yellow. And what I needed to do was, even though this light is or this part of the cascade is in the highlight, like it's in direct sunlight, not being blocked by the piling behind it, it still needs to have some deep areas, some shallow, some gullies, if you will, to tell the viewer, hey, it is cascading over here. Just because it's in light doesn't mean it's not cascading. So to make everything fit, if you will, without getting too technical, so what I'm trying to do to make this fit is that I'm trying to bring the shadowed areas into our highlight, our sun-drenched areas too. But to do that, I have to tone down my color. Why? Well, if I were to put the hard blacks like right here, look how hard that is. Whereas if I tone down my color and make it a little warmer, I still get that gullied area, but I don't have that harsh look to it. So whenever you move into a lighter area, you have to tone down your paint so that the contrast is not too much. I don't want heavy contrast here in this ripple water. I want good contrast, but not that much. Putting the pure dark green that we had in the shadowed areas would just be overkill, and it would draw way too much attention. Okay, so don't forget to step down your colors. It's a very essential part of painting, and one that people overlook. And maybe it's not even that they overlook, they're never been taught that they need to step down their colors as they get into their lighter shades or values. Okay, and blending everything in sometimes can be tricky, and I have to admit that there's a lot of times when I'm blending in from, like right here, I'm painting from a real heavy bubble into the translucent splashes on the edge. I can admit that there's times when I don't think I did such a great job and I reworked them. So if you're light enough with a touch and don't build up too much paint off the get-go, there's always that option to rework, and don't be afraid to rework. Why I brought that up is because people are under this assumption that us professionals never screw up. That is so far from the truth, it's not funny. Maybe it's not even that we screwed up, but maybe it's more of we changed our mind. We're halfway through something and you're like, wait a minute, if I change this and I paint it this way, it'll have more impact. So why wouldn't I do that? Why wouldn't I change it if I wanted more impact? It's well within our abilities to do so. So let's do it. So here, when you're doing the extreme splashes, we go back to our contrast theory. I'm using almost a pure titanium white now. I think I tinted it with just a little bit of raw sienna. And now it's a very high contrast. And why am I doing that? Well, because this is going to be, all those little bubbles have a hot spot. It's where the light enters. And then there's also a highlight at the bottom of a bubble, and that's where light escapes because it's translucent. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm putting in a lot of the tops and the bottoms. You can see if, let's take this for instance right here. You can see the light enters in through the top, but on the back side there's also a light that's exiting, and that's how you get good translucent cascading water. And here, because it's in the highlight, I'm using very warm colors, and that's why I tinted my titanium white with a little bit of raw sienna, so it gives it that little bit of warmth, because you can find that titanium white and unbleached titanium, especially unbleached titanium, is very more of a canvasy beige look. In titanium white, it's white, but it's cool. It has maybe a blue tinge to it, so you're warming it up. Now in this background area, I know it looks like it's bright and highlight, but I've actually toned down the white with a little bit of ultramarine blue and a little bit of Payne's gray, just so it doesn't, it's not as bright white as in the highlights. And the same thing here, that's the same mixture back here. When I'm going to the shorelines or in behind the highlighted areas, in a shadowed area, anywhere there's a shadowed area, I've used a little bit of ultramarine blue and a little Payne's gray. And why did I choose those two colors? Well, ultramarine blue keeps it a little warmer, and warmer in my palette because I use ultramarine blue red shade, so it has a lot more red in it than the ultramarine green shade is a lot cooler. But I use Payne's gray just to give it that little grayed look, but to keep it blue and to keep it cool, because this is in shadow, so you want it cool. And if I find that it gets a little too cool, then I'll warm it up again with a little bit, just a touch of dioxazine purple to give it that little bit of a purpley shade. And I kind of worked back and forth between the two when I did the shadowed areas in this cascading water, where some areas, like here's a good area to show you. There's a lot of purple here, but there's very little purple. There's more of the ultramarine blue in there. Actually, to tell you the truth, I think I used cerulean blue in the background. Yes, I did. I used cerulean blue. I didn't use ultramarine blue. I'm sorry. I used cerulean blue back there. And then when I get to the highlighted areas, again, this looks like it's pure white, but that's because it's on such a cooler background. But this, right out of the dish, was actually more of a bluey violet white, but it would look like a highlight because it's so much cool that's under it. So that's a thing to keep in mind, that when you're doing your highlights in the sun-drenched areas, keep them very warm, adding warmer colors to them. And in the shadowed areas, yes, you want to highlight them, but you want to highlight them with a touch of cooler colors. Now, as I work over to the right-hand side, this is a lot of cascading lots of bubbles, little bubbles. The left side was more of a structured bubble. This side is a little more of a random pattern of bubbles, and it's all in sunlight. So to accommodate for that and to tell everybody that this is in sunlight, what I did is I took this orangey background was the base color, and I actually added in a lot of titanium white and a lot of cadmium yellow light into it, and that made a very warm highlight. And I want warms. I want this to be drenched. Why? Because all of the translucent water, like beside it here, you can see through. It's actually kind of cool. So I want my cascading water to be very warm because it's in direct sunlight. It's catching sunlight, so you got to paint. You've got to translate that onto a board. And really, folks, that's all the painting is translating what you see through your eye onto a two-dimensional board. So making what you saw in 3 dimensions into a 2 dimension and making people go, oh yeah, I know exactly what you did here. So on this side, I want it to be a little more random, not so crescent shaped. On the left-hand side, lots of bubbles, so we had that repetitive, crescent shape that we varied size and altered the shape and that. But essentially, it's just a bunch of crescents over here. Well, on the right-hand side of the water, not only do we have cascading, but we have cascading that flows into a rippling, smoother water. Whereas on the left-hand side, it's a hard crashing cascading. Right-hand side, kind of a little bit of a hard crashing that flows into the general flow of the water. So we want to paint a little bit different. Now, because we have that flow into the water, we have to soften that cascade into the ripples, and that's why on this side I'm saying you get a little more random. Can you see now, even when I'm painting here, I'm not a straight out crescent. I'm making more of a jagged S curves and J curves, and varying it up all over the place, because I've got to translate again that this is going from a hard rippling water into a soft flowing water, so I have to bring those lines into it. And one of the ways is to do what I'm doing right now, which is taking a deep shadow color and just ripple, or kind of creating an undershadow. See how it's an undershadow? And that creates a little bit of a shape. So it's telling me that there's a little bit of a ridge under the water, and but it's not too high because we've kept that value a lot closer together. It's not as far away from each other as it is on the right hand side. The values are a lot closer, so it tells me that it's a more shallow ripple, right? But the same thing as the other side. It's still got splashes to it, so to indicate those splashes, I go through and I ping the area. And I call it ping the area because I'm just pinging some whites and some highlights into it. And this is just wherever you want the water to peak. Again, if you keep the values behind the pinging, like right here on the white, it tells me that it's just a little bit of a sparkle. It's not really raised. But if I paint down in this area against some darks, look at how much it raises up. Okay, so the more your values change, the higher your ping are. Broken record. We've said enough about that, so we'll continue off and get off of that subject for a while. But again, just want to ping and make lots of little tiny water splashes here, and this is where we're starting to really make the cascading come alive. And again, you want to be random, and big caution flag here, or big caution flag here. You don't want to do too much. I see people that start to paint these in and they're like, oh my god, that looks fantastic, so they start putting it everywhere. Well, if you start putting it everywhere, it loses its impact. You only want to put these highlight pings where there's a top or an arc, the apex, if you will, of a bubble. Okay, and you don't want them to be all through the water. You want them to be placed where there's going to be a little bit of a bubble and a ripple. And in some areas, like right here, if you want them to be a little deeper, give them a shadow. Just under-rib them, and boom, they become a little bit higher, see? So it's all playing with your values, and that's really what I wanted to harp with showing this video, is because values and the use of values and the use of warm and cool are essential to make these rippling. Not only your ability to texture, but those two things, the use of value and the use of warm and cool, are so important. But you can see that when you break it down and you go through the process of laying in your local colors, building up your shape and form through values, right, value changes, and then detailing, you get a really convincing effect here. And as a shadow here, I'm creating a bigger value depth, so I create more of a higher cascade, a more rigid cascade, if you will. The softening down here, just taking the yellows and just adding a little bit into the hard shadows areas, and what that does is it just softens off that transition between your shadowed areas coming into your highlighted areas, okay? And it's also translating, there's another change in plane here, because a ripple actually has a side to it too, right? So you just gotta translate that. And I'm trying to think about how I explain what I'm doing here. Not how to explain it, but the best way to explain it. I'm doing highlighting here, but what I'm also doing is I'm creating the directional flow of the water, and I do that by line. So I'm a little more firm in a line here, but I'm still breaking it up. I want a distinct line, but I don't want it hard continued line, because water really doesn't have any hard continued hides. And you see here I'm putting in the pure white again, just tinted with a little bit of raw sienna, and it makes nice high ripples. So there's a lot of splashing there, and the splashes are the fun. This is the end. This is where I get excited, because this is the payoff, right? You're at the very end, you're doing the final detailing, and this is the 10% we live for, because 90% of painting is setting up the structure and shape, and 10% is the detailing. The detailing is the fun part. So when you're detailing and you want to make distinct, like very distinct splashes, you're going to have more of a pronounced line. Like you can see here that I'm drawing a very pronounced line, and that's to make the hard rippled edges of a really the translucent splash, you know, where the wave is kind of splashing up into the air, so you can see through it, and it's you know, bouncing the light off of everywhere because the shape is all over the place. These are the ones that you try to be a little more hard edge. And here's a good zoom in detail. You can see that my line starts to get much more defined, and what I'm doing here is I'm directing people that this is where a hard edge to our wave is. Here's where a hard ping to a splash is. Here's an underside. Okay, this is the final dipping through and just building up all that really sharp detail, sharp detail. Whereas over here, you can see how it's a lot smoother. Whereas right here, very sharp, very crisp. They're defined splashes, and that's how you you can distinguish between a soft splash and a hard splash. So let's review. You want to start with a good base color. Make sure that's where your colors are all nice and gorgeous. Then you want to block in your value changes, creating your shape and form, and then you hit your highlights. Use crescent shapes for bigger out splashes, and a more random look for a kind of a fill-in splash. And there you go. There's cascading water. I'll paint this big bubble after I do the background, but there's a crash course on how to do cascading water. Hope it helps you in your painting. Happy painting, everybody.